Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of the RockyTerrain podcast. Today is April the 1st, 2021. My name is Thomas and with me as always is Dennis.
Hello there.
In today's episode, we're going to talk about a dig site Dennis is working at. So if you're interested in paleontology and a bit about geology, then you're welcome to stay. But first of all, before we will transition into our main topic, Dennis, is there something happening in your life that you want to talk about?
Yeah, actually, there is. I am currently preparing for the final exam of my bachelor's degree, so closing in on the end. Yeah.
And then you're finally done.
Yeah. In summer, I am going to be off to Bonn, or at least that's the plan, to make my master's degree there. And yeah, so far so good. Currently, I'm still doing collection work, as I've already mentioned in the last episode.
In the museum. Collection work in the museum.
Yeah. Indeed, collection work at the museum, at the Natural History Museum. Digging season is closing in. Of course, I'm looking forward to it. And later on, we're going to talk a little bit more about said dig site. But otherwise, not really too much new. I've recently
Shame on you.
I've recently received a paper which I'm going to read maybe later today on a pterosaur species. It's basically a description of the postcranial characteristics of a particular pterosaur. So everything behind the head, basically, neck downwards. Yeah, but honestly, not really much new happening currently. The big news are going to come in summer with me moving to Bonn and basically starting to live in a different city. So
big news.
Yeah, or not even the big news, just times are going to be more, how do you say? There's going to be more going on in summer. Yeah, but what about you?
Well, first of all, there's something I nearly completely forgot. There's something happening on Mars. So, a little update on Perseverance. Have you seen that the Ingenuity helicopter drone is now in its deployment stage?
I have heard that it is about to have its first flight, but once again, I'm not really following as much as you do. So,
okay,
please tell us.
So it's a very slow process over, I think, some days actually. They started with just deploying the shield, which it shielded from the surrounding air, basically. And then it slowly began to move out of the rover's chassis. And then it slowly started to spin vertical and to deploy its legs. And in its current state, it's still attached to the rover, hovering like some centimeters above the ground. And the legs are deployed and just waiting to touch the ground. I don't know when it will be. I don't think that they have yet told in which day it will happen. I think the last thing I read was April 8 on Twitter, but I don't know how official that was. But that was the day that I had in my mind.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. So that's about Mars news. And then for me, so next week or in 2 weeks, our semester is starting again. And today I had my last exam of the first semester of my master's. So that's kind of closed now and I can now transition into the new semester, which will also be online for most of the parts, at least till... Well, that's now a pitfall because I don't think that there's an English word for that. We have like a 2-week holidays before the summer in Germany. And yeah, that's till that point, everything will be online.
Yeah. There were updates just today.
Yeah.
So I haven't read through it so far. Got to do it later on.
Yeah, it's basically just to that point. It will be on online.
Yeah. Okay.
So I actually try to Pentecost. It's the English word for that. I think. At least Google tells that. Anyway, yeah. Besides that, for 2 weeks ago, there was the LPSC, so the Lunar and Planetary Science Conference, which is basically the biggest conference in planetary science, which normally takes place in Houston in the Woodlands, but due to the current situation, this year is still gonna be online. But at least they've hoped that they can do it again in person next year. Hopefully, they said. Yes, and yeah, so for the conference, they were basically, you have to submit, as most of the conferences, abstracts, in which you basically log into the conference, join the conference, and I have submitted 2 abstracts, one about a project on Mars I'm working on, and one about a project that worked for my bachelor thesis and will work on in my master thesis, which is about lunar tectonics, in which I had a talk, and I think I talked about the talk the last time, kind of about the problems I encountered by pre-recording a talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With
your
makeshift green screen.
Yeah. So definitely very interesting. It was a really interesting experience, definitely. But I think the online part, it was definitely okay because we have to do some, just things can't be normal now. So I think it was okay what I've done to at least give the feeling of a more normal conference. You had like different ways to chat to each other. There was like this small browser game basically, where you can walk around in rooms with your face cam on and talk to people. And I've seen that people just on Twitter and on the chat website, or on the chat that was available, they made dates together, which they can talk to each other. And so there was still a lot of talking to each other. However, it was kind of difficult for me, I think. I wasn't really in contact with anyone during the whole conference because, I don't know, this whole online thing, I tried to, but it just... in person, there's like a poster session or anything like that, and then there's a guy or a woman standing in front of the poster. And you're just walking to them, you look at the poster, and then you're just naturally starting to talk to each other. And there you have your contact. Or you're doing a talk, and after the talk, someone will come to you, or you go to someone to just tell them, yeah, that was a nice talk. But with the online sessions, if you want to write someone an email about a poster, for example, then, you would need one question. You would not write an email of, oh, that's a cool poster, and that's it. There's just not the personal interaction. And then we had the idea to do you had the opportunity to do a Zoom meeting or a Skype meeting of your poster where people could join and ask you questions. You had like the small, there was like an option to put it into your poster so that people will see, right, at this day, at this time, you could join the meeting. However, I've already heard now about many persons, and also for me personally, nobody joined. So you just sat there half an hour alone, waiting for people to join. So that was kind of, I don't know. yeah, it could have been cooler, let's put it like that. But I think that I tried their best to do this normal as possible. Yeah, and then the talk. So the pre-recorded talk is about 50 minutes long, and which I nearly completely collapsed because I wasn't able to get it below 15 minutes, and then tried to do some magic with cutting till I got to the point where it's slightly below 15 minutes, because I thought, well, when you try to upload it, there is a text that says below 50 minutes. So I thought you wouldn't be able to upload anything that is longer than 50 minutes. Turned out there were actually a lot of talks that were a bit longer than 50 minutes. So it doesn't seem to be that much of a problem. Well,
yeah, better safe than sorry.
Yeah, and then the live session, in which you should give a 3-minute lightning presentation with all the other guys in your session, basically, which mine was about lunar tectonics and interior problems, I think, or interior questions, something like that, which was led by Paul Byrne. And yeah, so I was there with 6 other people. Yeah, and I have some problems with that. I mean, in the end, my talk I thought was pretty good. It was directly 3 minutes long, and I think I've put everything into what you could possibly put into 5 minutes. 3 minutes.
3. Who knows?
3 minutes. But, the idea is that you give people watch you talk first, and then you give like a 3-minute presentation, so people are refreshed and reminded of what it's about, and then they can ask questions. But I don't think that really worked. I had the feeling that the questions were more, not that deep, and that most of the people just try to get questions from these small talks. And putting something you've worked on into 3 minutes is basically impossible. I mean, you can do that, but it's scientific work. Scientific work is not made for telling people in 3 minutes, at least I think.
How did you try to manage it?
It was...
I think that's pretty interesting, because somehow you still gotta do it. How did you do it?
Yeah. So I made like a very small introduction, like 30 seconds, 40, maybe 40 seconds, which I just said, yeah. So that's my topic about. Now let's move on. I basically didn't say anything about my method, I think. And then I've just gone quickly through like the main the main outcomes of the work, like just the main parts. I'm like, okay, this is what I think is important. Here you go. And I didn't give any details on that. It's just like really the important part that I think I found out, and I didn't go into why I think that's the case. Just basically, there it is.
Yeah.
That's how it looks like, and that's why we think is happening. And finish.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, and also not only Paul Byrne, but also Dr. C. Nohara. C. Nohara. Before I forgot that. Yeah. So it was okay. I got like one question, which I couldn't directly answer because I was kind of confused about the question. First of all, it was like directly at the end, and I just didn't thought there would go any question to me. And then this question was a very good question, but that was not what I've directly worked on. It's just kind of it's kind of part of my work, but it's not the main part I've worked on. So I was very confused because I didn't think this question would come. So I kind of tried to answer it, but I thought I did. I didn't think that I've done bad, but I wish I could have gotten a new answer, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it happens.
Yeah.
I haven't done something like that yet, so I don't really know what to say, because I'm pretty sure that's pretty normal.
Yeah.
So
I think so too.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's the updates that I want to talk about. So if there isn't anything you want to add,
No, not really.
then I would say let's go into a small break and return with our main part of today.
Indeed.
Over our last podcast, Dennis often talked about the work he's doing at the Natural History Museum, and he always gave some small insights into what he's doing. But we thought, or he thought, that it would be actually very interesting to talk about what he's actually working on, and a bit about the geology and the paleontology and all the things that might be interesting. So that's what we are going to do today. And with that, I would just let you on the stage.
Yeah, so I've really been looking forward to this, as I try to give you my best Count Dooku voice and horribly
Yeah. I didn't know what that was. I was just very confused.
Gotta work on that one. Improvisation, do you like it?
Yeah. I put it with a bad smiley on my list.
No, I've been really looking forward to this because, as you've already said, I've always touched on this, and I've always really been meaning to talk about this dig site because it's really been my first experience some 2 years back of doing actual excavation work in paleontology, and at the same time, it's a pretty interesting site, not because of the spectacular, huge dinosaur skeletons you could find or anything. To be exact, it's just the opposite, because the most relevant finds there are actually very small. But the history of this dig site, the way these deposits might have come about, is actually the most interesting part, I think, about this whole thing. And yeah, what I would now like to do is give you guys kind of, well, actually my personal perspective on this. I would like to give you guys my perception of my first times entering this dig site, and then we're going to go in its depositional history, and I'm trying to outline how maybe these deposits came about. So to begin, this dig site is located in Balve, a village in the Sauerland in northern Germany, or near Balve to be exact. In 2019, I did 3 weeks of professional training, practical training, which we have to do in order to obtain our bachelor's degree. These 3 weeks were mostly digging work. You went to the field 2 to 3 times a week with the leading paleontologist at that site and some other students working for the Natural History Museum. And I was actually pretty late in the season. My practical training took part in August. So actually pretty late in digging season. The last half week of my 3 weeks there actually mostly consisted of getting this site ready for winter. But yeah, 2.5 weeks were digging work. And what's pretty interesting here is that immediately, at least if you have some experience with geology, you notice that something is odd there. Because, well, when you arrive, all you can see is limestone. Massive gray limestone. And limestone isn't... This limestone is way older than even the dinosaurs that I knew. And then you have this, crevice. This big crevice with a reddish gray infill. So it's basically a crevice about, I would like to say, some 10 meters across, some maybe 20 meters high, just in the middle of this limestone. So you can just see that there is an infill in the middle of this limestone, which just doesn't really belong there. And this is the point of interest for us, because this is a Lower Cretaceous deposit, a deposit from the age of dinosaurs. And what we're doing there is we extract these clays and we extract the fossils from these clays. And one thing you can notice immediately at that site is that these clays are actually not really, well, rocks in that sense. They are very hard sediment, but despite the fact that they're so old, about some 120 to 130 million years old, they aren't really that hard. And then was the first thing which really, kind of blew my mind, because I couldn't really wrap my head around the fact that this wasn't even real rock. This was just basically a hard sediment. And I'm going to...
So, sorry, how does it feel like? Is it like mushy, or I can't imagine what it feels like to touch?
It's actually pretty hard if it's dry.
Mm-hmm.
But you notice that it isn't really too hard because you can break small fragments out of it. So like it's a little brittly, kind of like that.
Yeah, so you can brittly hard sand, something like that.
Yeah, very hard brittly sand, kind of like that. And that's actually very, very advantageous for us, because this makes these sediments rather easy to work with. Because what you can do is you can moist these sediments with water. So these are moisted up so that they become softer again. And what happens then is that you use something we call a Tonschlaufe, German word of the day. Directly translated, it would mean something like clay loop. It's actually something I think used in sculpting. You can kind of imagine it like a vegetable peeler. This is what I always compare it to. Because it's basically a wooden stick with some wire on top of it. And you actually kind of use it just as you would a peeler, because you just take slices out of this moisted up clay sediment. And what happens then is you have these fragments, these clay fragments, which then get collected and then get dried up again. So at first you have to moist them because you have to soften them up. You have to soften them up to extract the clay. And then it's dried up again in order to make it more brittle. Each cycle of getting it moist and then re-drying it basically forms more cracks in these clay sediments. Yeah, so this is basically the first step. And the next step then would be, after this clay has dried out, to pre-clean it a first time. So basically it's just the sediment is washed with water so that most of the clay is already extracted. At least this is what has been done most of the time. Last year it was a bit more of a special situation because we didn't really have that many people in the field. So this step was taken care of a little bit differently, but that's generally what you do.
So it's not like the work where you, like, I don't know, dig into stone to search like for large bones or anything like that. It's a bit different work that you would imagine.
Yeah. That's actually the first thing which also bewildered me, because when you think about paleontology, the thing you think about is people working with hammers and chisels and just slowly, bit by bit, picking away at the rock. And actually, you couldn't believe how confused I was when I started working there. I mean, I was into paleontology my entire life, but I had never really seen something like that. And this is why at first I even thought, maybe this is already redeposited material. Maybe something which during the ice ages had been extracted from somewhere else and had then been deposited in this crevice. Or I couldn't really wrap my head around why exactly these sediments aren't that solid. I hadn't experienced something like that before. And honestly, it took me about 1 year until I finally fully appreciated, after continuous explaining from the lead paleontologist, what exactly could have taken place there. And as you'll see later, there is still some degree of discussion about that. Yeah, but now we're at the step where these clays have been worked on the first time, where the sediment has been worked on the first time with water. It's then, after this pre-cleaning, dried up once again, creating even more cracks in clay blocks. And then we enter the final stage, during which the sediment is given into a plastic tub and water is poured on it until all the sediment is covered with water. And then it soaks for a day or two. It softens up. And then, by far the most work-heavy step follows, which is screen washing. Screen washing is basically a method where you sift the material through sieves of different mesh sizes by hand. So you can imagine you're sitting in front of a tub with water, you put your sediment on top of the sieve, and then you start shaking and shaking and shaking until, well, all that's left is little tiny fragments of rocks, minerals, and fossils on top of the sieve. And this amount of work for really tiny fossils, you mostly can't even see before you've sifted them. This might sound pretty strange. Why would someone put that much effort into it? But I'm going to get into why this is very important.
Yeah, just to say, it's kind of addicting. Because, I mean, I've not worked with you, but there was like this one day at the afternoon when I came back from university, where you did that in public. And I was like, okay, I can buy like, I don't know, 15 minutes and see what you do, and then I go. I think I ended up staying there like some hours, just sitting next to you, looking at the things you sieved. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's it, because you never know what could be in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's maybe a short introduction from my perspective. That's what is done at that site. And that maybe gives some insight into the strangeness of what we do there. It's pretty unconventional, but at the same time pretty fascinating. And it's just this weird situation with this crevice filled with mud, which is significantly younger than the surrounding rock. It's not what you would usually see, for example, in the Morrison Formation, which is pretty famous for its dinosaurs like Allosaurus, Diplodocus, and for these mass accumulations of dinosaurs in these vast river deposits and lake deposits and stuff like that. That's not what we're doing here, but that doesn't really mean that it isn't special or that it isn't important. Yeah, but so much for that. Any other questions so far?
Not so far, no. I think till that point, I'm up to date.
All right, because I've been working there last year as well. Did my practical training there in 2019, and then last year I actually started working for the museum, and I'm doing so till this very day. But now it begs the question, why exactly do we have these weird deposits? And to explain that, I would really like to go back, start with the formation of the rock our crevice is situated in, to give everybody a full perspective on how everything might have occurred. And then I'm going to also talk a bit about the animals we find and why this dig site is really rather important to us. So to start with the formation of the limestone, which is essentially the fundament. You gotta imagine that the Sauerland has a vast region where this gray limestone is available at the surface, where it outcrops on the surface. It's actually pretty remarkable because oftentimes you'll just drive through these canyons, valleys with tens of meters high limestone walls directly next to you, which is really, really, really impressive. It's a very, very beautiful sight there. And in Germany, we call this the Massenkalk, which would roughly translate to, massive chalk, massive limestone, just because it's pretty massive. It's a pretty hard limestone, and it's a very prevalent rock there. And this limestone actually has its origins in a reef. So you have to imagine that back in the Devonian, in the middle upper Devonian, there was a shallow shelf sea covering much of this region of Germany and Europe in general, because most of the time sea levels were significantly higher than they are today. And what you can imagine is that you have this reef, a very, very vast reef. This is actually a topic the University of Münster is working on, the ecology and development of these reefs over time in the Upper Devonian. So I came into contact with this reef formation again and again and again during paleontology classes. Many organisms in these reefs, they form calcitic shells, or in general calcareous shells, hard parts, especially corals. And in this age, basically you have really, really vast reefs. Maybe more vast than any time before or ever since then. So it's very, very, very impressive. Yeah, and so over time you develop these very, very massive deposits. And what happens later, after deposition of all this calcareous material, is that you have the Variscan orogeny. So what happens is that you have continent collisions, which then form what should later be known as the supercontinent Pangaea. So you have to imagine that this deposition of this limestone took place over 360 million years ago. They are older than that even. And that's a long time before the dinosaurs even. And then you have this Variscan orogeny following that in the late Carboniferous and Permian period, and this supercontinent Pangaea is formed, which maybe at least some people may know as the supercontinent, which is present when the dinosaurs are around, when the dinosaurs start to conquer the Earth, so to speak. And what happens with our limestones is they get compressed and folded and lifted up. You have this vast mountain range, which also outcrops these sediments and everything which was deposited after that. And this mountain range formed during that time is then later on eroded. So that over time you establish a more flat terrestrial plane than in the age of dinosaurs. And in general, as we then enter the age of dinosaurs, this is where karstification starts. And this karstification is really important for us because this is what then forms cavities in the limestone, which should later be filled with sediment. And this is actually has been shown because of some hydrothermal minerals which have been found.
Hydrothermal. Interesting.
Yeah.
It's not just groundwater, but okay.
Yeah, I mean it's been a point of discussion, but there is a paper talking about tectonic movements at the Jurassic Cretaceous boundary causing hydrothermal activity. I mean, yeah, remember these rocks have been lifted and maybe even a bit exposed during the Variscan orogeny. And of course, limestone exposed to the elements on the surface can also be karstified.
Yeah.
Because basically what happens when limestone comes into intense contact with water that it's slowly eroded away, that the limy compartments of it are slowly soluted and carried away by the water flowing above it or through it, through cracks and stuff like that.
That's what I have imagined when you've talked about this area.
Yeah, actually that was because I started to puzzle this together for myself bit by bit at first, and this is what I thought at first as well, that maybe these just some groundwaters opened up cracks, or maybe that cracks formed and that water flowing through it, maybe groundwater flowing through it, then just sized up these cracks until you had these vast crevices which could be effectively filled with enough sediment for fossils to be caught in them as well. But yeah, there is some evidence for hydrothermal activity, and that seems to be a process which played a role in there, because I mean, there's also still some discussion going on whether you had cave formation underground. I mean, that's the thing we're mostly talking about, or the leading scientists are mostly talking about, that maybe some cavities formed underground, and then these later then open up, that the top also slowly open up, and that sediments began to sink in.
So they collapsed, basically.
Yeah, they collapsed, but I'm going to get to the details of that in a bit anyway, so maybe I'll just continue on. We know that this wasn't a solitary occurrence, so these crevices, I take a drink every time I say crevice in this episode. Drink responsibly. But we know that there are a couple of filled crevices. And the interesting thing here is that these are of different ages. So they're not just Lower Cretaceous, they're also at times way, way, way younger than that. There are, for example, Miocene and Pliocene occurrences, which are well after the time of dinosaurs. And so this phenomenon, is still a bit elusive. And this is what I mean with it's pretty different, because you have these patchy occurrences. Basically, it's just finding, these cavities with a sediment in them, which doesn't really belong there, because it's definitely nothing which just was flushed in there from the forests nearby. And it's definitely nothing belonging in these marine coral reef limestone deposits. Well, shelf deposits anyway. And this is actually, I think, the most interesting part, that you never really know how many ones could still be out there. Because it has been discovered a couple of times before, but at least some of them are said to be completely devoid of fossils. You have microfossils, so pollen and spores, so that they could be dated, because you can use microfossils like pollen and spores to get an idea of how old deposits are. Because you can see which plants were around, and then you can compare it to other sites, and you can basically then make out which plants were present at your site. And by comparison, you can see which site from which time it's most similar to, and this is how these different caves or cave fillings were explained, dated. So that's basically what's going on there. That's the general setting. And now I would actually like to come to the Lower Cretaceous and to give an idea of what exactly was deposited and how it might have been deposited. So we have the karstified limestone, be it that these were caves which later caved in, or just open canyons, open cracks, wide cracks. I often hear that it was rather the first idea, that these were caves which later just collapsed. But on the other hand, I've heard the other idea discussed as well, and I don't really know anybody who would claim that it must have been one or the other per se. Okay. I've read different interpretations in papers, so the literature.
An active field.
It's an active field of research. But what we know is that, as I've said, these sediments from Balve are of a Lower Cretaceous age, also determined by spores and pollen, by microfossils basically. It's been dated to late Barremian to early Aptian stage for everybody who might want to know more in detail. So some 130 to 120 million years old, or 125, kind of in that ballpark at least. Because with plant remains, it's not an absolute method of dating, it's more a relative method of dating, because it's just comparing to other deposits, We know that different types of sediment came to rest there. Mostly these sediments we see are very fine sediments, so clayey, silty. You can't really see the grains of the sediment with the naked eye. Then, once again, it's not really an absolute kind of thing, because sometimes there are even more sandy layers in there. You can see that some clays are more of a rusty reddish-gray color, and some are more of a middle gray color, so it's not really that you would say it's just one event. It's not really just one rapid deposition. You see that there are different sediments on top of each other.
Are they layered, or is it more or less like washy borders in between them?
Excellent question, because that plays directly into the next point. Both.
Okay.
It's actually also still something we're trying to grasp because, well, some areas seem very layered and very structured. And then again, other layers are completely chaotic. And sometimes they're right next to each other. So, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's been a long time since I've been there myself. I've been there in 2019. Last year I wasn't there. But of course, you keep talking about it, and of course, the lead scientist there, he always told us about what's going on. He gave us a briefing for this year already, because of course he wants us to know what's going on. But from what I recall, it's really sometimes very dramatic. So you have these horizontal layers of this grayish material with some sandy horizons in there of maybe about 1 or 2 centimeters height. And then right next to that is an area with this more reddish clay, which just has this completely wavy structure. And it seems to just intercalate with these grayish clays horizontally. So it's just next to that on the same level of height. And these more chaotic layers often also have rather big chunks of sometimes even 1 or 2 cubic meters, I would say, of this limestone of the surrounding area in them. So you see that maybe this was a more violent filling of this gap, while other sediments, it's still a good question how exactly this came about. I mean, oftentimes I told museum visitors, because that's what I also knew what was discussed at times, that maybe at times, maybe annually, maybe sub-annually, maybe rather as events all tens of years, sediment was flushed in there by flooding events or something like that. Because we know that this was a terrestrial area. We know that this was not a marine setting, that this was a fully terrestrial setting, because we have terrestrial animals there. Dominantly. I mean, you can find fish scales as well, but mostly it's terrestrial animals, from big to small. And not only that, but we also find rounded pebbles in there. What does that tell you?
Not a question to me. Well, rounded means that there was obviously a longer way of transportation, so that the borders or the angles got rounded up over time. So that could be, like, for example, in river, or
exactly
close.
Exactly. That's one aspect. We see that we have rounded pebbles of different sizes. We see that there are rocks which are actually still present in the Sauerland till this very day. And you can see other minerals and rock fragments, rounded rock fragments, which must have come from further away. There is actually a bachelor thesis on this, which hasn't been published. I would have to read through it one day, because I think the result was that most still are available locally, but you can see that some have to just have come from rather far away. And also, as I've said, you don't really have much in terms of big fossils there. But what you find is damaged, heavily damaged and isolated. And this, once again, is something you typically see if something has been transported for a long time, because dead bodies disintegrate. They separate into isolated bones. These bones, then again, they get jammed against other objects in the river. They come into contact with the sediment, and surface material of the bone gets eroded away. And this is what we see in the fossils, because most fossils are damaged. The large ones mostly, but even the small ones often are damaged. So this is the one thing that we see, that there seems to have been this fluviatile river setting. We know that it was nearshore, more or less, a nearshore setting. But on the other hand, you have these extensive clay material. These very fine clays usually aren't what you would associate with rivers. Because rivers, it's always a question of what can settle in the flowing medium. A river has a lot of energy. It carries even bigger clasts with it, so sandy grains or even small pebbles. While in a river where the water is way more calm, even clay sediment can slowly sink to the bottom.
When the water is flowing really slowly, and then they can sink.
Yeah. So this is the other side of the coin, that there is really a lot of clay present. And this once again tells you that maybe it wasn't necessarily just a river setting, because this is the dominant material. Of course, you have some horizons with a lot of pebbles, some horizons with more sandy grains in there. But you also have some with a rather poor classed record, with not much in terms of pebbles or something like that. So it seems to have been terrestrial. It seems to have been some kind of a river / lake system. It seems it was a more or less lowland nearshore environment. And we know that there are bones of all kinds of different animals present, especially in the small range you only can see under a microscope, really. So you can also say that, it's likely that whatever carried these bones here must have collected bones and bodies from a rather vast area because of this high diversity. It's just at least an argument for that. Because what you can find there is a very, very vast array. I've already talked about, for example, fishes. But it's not only that, because you have fishes, probably teeth, you have elements of sharks even.
Oh. Whoa.
But before you get too excited, it's very small fragments and likely freshwater sharks.
Okay. Yeah, that was why I was confused.
In the literature, it was cited as hybodont or hybodontiform sharks. I'll send you a link. Also, one of the most abundant fossil present are fragments of turtle shells. Different kinds of turtle shells even, but it's, if you find something in the field, chances are it's going to be a turtle or a fragment of a turtle, because you really don't find anything associated That's also a thing speaking for river deposits. Who knows? Maybe a river ended up in a lake at that place where we're digging now. Because nothing is really associated. Everything has fallen apart. Everything are isolated bones and broken apart bones, damaged bones, except for the really small microscopic fraction. But that's likely maybe because bigger objects tend, because of their weight, to drop to the bottom. They come into contact with more material. That's why they're more damaged, while smaller things like small tiny teeth, they are more likely to stay afloat in the water column so that they come into contact with less obstacles, get less damaged. But turtles.
Yeah, turtles.
Turtles are all over the place. Crocodiles are the next kind of animal I would like to talk about, because these are
kind of animal.
Kind of animal.
Okay.
Not kind of animal. Crocs are awesome.
Yeah.
They belong to archosaurs, the single greatest taxon of living things ever. So now that we've gotten that out of the way and that I've established that, crocodiles are very diverse there. And once again, mostly represented by the microscopic fraction of teeth. But the teeth diversity of crocodilians is very, very diverse. So from herbivorous or maybe herbivorous crocodiles to diurophagous crocodiles, meaning clam-eating, hard-shell, organism-eating, to carnivorous. And especially what's very interesting is that there is a vast abundance of these very tiny teeth of crocs. You also find osteoderms.
Herbivores? Plant eating?
Yeah.
Oh.
There were herbivorous crocs around during the Mesozoic. Yeah, it's something you could talk on about for hours and hours and hours, because crocodile or crocodilian diversity in the Mesozoic, in the age of dinosaurs, is tremendous. You have such a vast amount of different crocodiles. Crocodiles you couldn't even imagine today.
True.
Crocodiles even with teeth very similar to mammal teeth.
Yeah, but you're true. There's always this one video, which is suddenly on YouTube. But at that point I thought, okay, now I know a lot of crocs, and then there's this one video which suddenly tells me about a croc I've never could have imagined before.
Crocs are wonderful and they're weird, and what we have left today is just really one type of ecology surviving till this day, but it was incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Just Google Mesozoic crocodilians and you're gonna be busy for a few days. Then what we also have is, and that's a pretty new development, and I think everybody has been looking forward to that, salamanders. There's actually a new genus. Who am I? I am just a helping student. I wasn't involved with the literature, although I hope I'll be at some point. The new genus Balve herpeton was erected last year, which is known from, one vertebra, or at least one type of vertebra, but that's actually enough for salamander experts, or our salamander expert, to distinguish it from all other known salamanders around at that time. And while that doesn't really sound very special at first, this is actually what this site is maybe most interesting for, because this continues on. because there are also teeth of mammals at that site. And teeth of mammals are the most special thing, maybe, because there have actually been two new genera with one species each described later last year as well. One is Brocterodon alatus and Chiruscodon balvensis. And these are only known from isolated teeth as well. But mammal teeth, just think of your own chewing teeth, are very complex. You can notice mammal teeth because they have multiple roots. All other kinds of animals usually only have one root. And then, mammal teeth are very distinguishable. We have multiple bumps and ridges on our teeth, which mostly are specific to certain genera or species of mammals. So they're very, very good tools to distinguish different animal or mammal groups and mammal species even. So that's really where it's all at, because these small animals are actually the important stuff. These are actually the interesting stuff, and that's the stuff you will only find if you've sifted tons and tons, and that's not even an exaggeration. We've worked through, what was it last year? I think 5 tons of sediment during the season. I actually calculated it, but I'm not sure of the exact amount anymore. But it was a couple of tons of sediment. And we actually found new mammal teeth last year.
I think the point is everybody is like, oh wow, small mammals, small, the salamanders. They're everywhere. You can find them everywhere today. There are thousands, But that's the interesting point. They are far spread. We know that they're everywhere, but they're very rare, fossilized. So that's why that's so interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Because small animals tend to get lost in the fossil record. And that, once again, goes back to episodes 2 and 3. Yeah, because there are a lot of filters in place of what we can actually know. And small animals are more likely to be lost than bigger animals, or to just be overlooked, because everybody looks at big bones. Everybody wants to save the big bones, wants to save the great precious dinosaurs, and I mean, I'm one of them. So who am I to judge? But they tend to be overlooked, and this is why this site is so important and so interesting, because the diversity of microfossils there, microvertebrates, is astonishing and gives us an idea of what creepy crawlies, what small mammals, and in general smaller animals were around during the Lower Cretaceous. I mean, there are other types of animals around. You find isolated bones of dinosaurs, but they're rare, and they're not really what you're after at that digging site. You find isolated dinosaur teeth as well, but mostly from one big herbivore, Iguanodon. Everything else is pretty rare. Yeah, and the question remains for us, how exactly did it get deposited? Because we have this river setting, we have somehow these gaps, caves underground, something of that nature. And what I tended to tell museum visitors last year was that maybe there were these flash flood events, as I said, maybe annually, maybe sub-annually, maybe all 10 years or something, during which maybe these sediments were flushed into these not canyons, that would be too big, but these ridges. But then again, that wouldn't really explain why these deposits sometimes are so layered. Yeah,
Do we know the time span?
That's an interesting thing as well, because I mean, we've discussed about that a fair few times, and I mean, you have some areas where you can see very, very fine layering if you look closer, and yeah, maybe there could be some 10,000 years in these different cycles. So not each layer, but if you have one sedimentary unit with all these fine layerings in there, that this indicates that there were multiple sedimentation cycles, and if this was just the background sedimentation of a lake, yeah, who knows how long it could have been. It's really, really difficult to understand how much time is in a sedimentary body, because of course you can have layers of 1 meter thickness in some areas which could have been deposited during one landslide event. You could have an equally thick sedimentary body with very fine clay sediment, which could have resulted from clay just sinking to the bottom of a lake over tens of thousands of years. And at that dig site, it's very difficult, I would say, because yeah, maybe it was these flooding events that mud was just flushed into these ridges, or the other thing which has also been hypothesized, and one thing which has become more relevant since last year, once again because of new sedimentary structures, is that maybe these layers were deposited on top of a cavity, which began to form underground through these hydrothermal and groundwater activities. And this could also maybe explain, I think, this is nothing anybody told me, but this is just my 2 cents. I mean, I don't know. I haven't really worked on the sedimentation there or anything, but it's just, I think, it sounds logical to me, because you have these neighboring river-like and lake-like deposits, that maybe this could explain why these are neighbored, because maybe at times a lake was established there, then this lake could have dried out over time, it could have been replaced by a river arm, maybe at times a river ended in a lake there, so that you would have maybe these clay sediments with a river then transporting all kinds of clasts into these sediments or something like that. Yeah, and then that eventually the sediments, after being kind of hardened a little bit so that they would have been a cohesive unit, would have started slowly sinking into this cavity underground, which would explain why at times the layers are kind of vertical, sometimes kind of horizontal, maybe. Yeah, it's a lot of maybe, because on the other hand, you can see that clasts have been ripped, clasts of the surrounding limestone have been ripped into these sediments as well. It's difficult, but that's what makes it fun.
Yeah. And of course, could be also a mixture of different things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other, and that's what would be even more interesting. And I'm really looking forward to future interpretations. What we can say with certainty is that the surrounding sediment is gone. It's just gone. And yeah, actually, that's also kind of an interesting question, why this is the case.
Yeah, flashbacks.
Yeah.
Flashbacks to my Mars project.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's I don't know, it's really an interesting question, So these sediments likely have just eroded away. So,
Yeah.
I mean, just in the case of, if you would think that these sediments were deposited on top of these cavities, or this cavity, I mean, you would think that these sediments have sunken into the crevice, and everything more exposed could have then been subject to erosion. So that everything has been eroded away, and only everything which has been deposited underground basically has this protective layer of limestone around it. And that's and that's really what, in my mind, everything comes down to, that this is a very special window back into the Cretaceous, because if we wouldn't have these crevices, we wouldn't even know it was there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a perfect example how patchy the rock archive is, and that you sometimes need also a bit of luck to get, as you said, a window is actually a beautiful analogy for that case, to get these windows back in time. Because as you said, if they have not existed, all the information on this time was probably gone from that point.
Yeah, absolutely. And just imagine how much must be gone, because these lowland river settings usually aren't small. So this is not kind of one arm of a river, likely. And this is, we also get this feeling because, this is not the only filling from that time. We know from different such infills, which are of similar age but are mostly devoid of any macroscopic fossils, even microvertebrates, I think nothing. But 60 kilometers distance, there is the site at Neden, Brilon-Neden, where iguanodons have been found. And this deposit seems to have been, deposited, for lack of a better term, in a very similar fashion. It seems also that some layers there were oriented vertically. Some seemed kind of folded, kind of awkwardly deposited, so not really looking natural. So the interpretation also was that maybe these sediments formed some kind of cohesion with each other. So the grains formed cohesion with each other, were kind of pre-hardened, and then started sinking into this cavity below, slowly but surely. And just the fact that, in my mind, that some 60 kilometers away from this dig site, there is a similarly aged dig site, this gives you kind of an idea of the scale of this type of area, And this is really the interesting thing, because now you have these two data points you can connect. And then what has been done in the past has been looking at adjacent areas. For example, we tend to, at first, always look over to Britain, look at their Wealden fossils, for instance, from the Isle of Wight, and try to correlate whether there's some connection. And surprise, surprise, there is a connection, because we have a pretty similar fauna, at least in certain regards, to theirs. For example, Balve herpeton, the salamander, known from this, or it wasn't, I said one vertebra, there are more than one vertebra. But these seem to show a rather close relationship to some Wealden forms from Britain. So this goes to show that there seems to have been a connection.
Yeah. I think they are very important in order to try to reconstruct our world back then. How Germany or Europe, Middle Europe basically looked like back then in the late Cretaceous. Yeah. I mean, you have many data points from the oceans, but how the terrestrial parts this is a bit more difficult to tell often.
Yeah, indeed. That's the thing, because as I've said, mostly, or at least a lot of rock sequences from the Mesozoic are terrestrial. Marine.
Yeah.
The opposite. Marine. I mean, you have situations like with Germany's biggest theropod, or kind of. There has been this Torvosaurus described last year from a few skull fragments and potentially one toe bone, which might have been a bit bigger, but at least one of the biggest predatory dinosaurs from Germany has been found in marine rocks. So animals can be flushed out to sea. Dinosaurs could be flushed out to sea, and could then have been found in marine environments, because at some time the body would have sunk into the bottom and would have been covered in mud in this sea setting. But you have to be lucky for that. And these direct terrestrial settings are really rare. Yeah. And this is why it's really is so important, and why you have to look into that. And I just love the fact that at the same time it's so weird.
Yeah, that's also where kind of the fun is. I mean, yeah, sometimes it's nice when things just work, but on the other hand, often the most interesting parts are when you don't think that there would be a problem, and then suddenly you realize what's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah. And the final thing I would like to touch on is, why the hell isn't it that hard? That's one thing I wanted to leave open until the end. Why are these sediments still so soft? Yeah, well, because who knows? Maybe, at least, I mean, that's purely speculation on my part. Yeah. I mean, if you would imagine that they've been flushed into these valleys, that they have been deposited there by maybe seasonal occurrences, or that they have sunken in there before they could become rocks properly, in the sense that we use in geology. Maybe they just never received the pressure necessary, because they were just laying in this crevice and didn't really experience the pressure necessary. So that despite the fact that they are so old, they, well, basically retained their hard sedimentary form.
Yeah, sounds plausible.
I mean, my first thought was, when I arrived there, when I spent my first 3 weeks there in 2019, I was actually thinking that this must have been redeposited.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, there are sediments, even rocks, which brittle away in your hands. That can occur. But I've never seen something like that before. And I mean, you can just pour water onto it, and it becomes the same clay again. And that's actually, you know what? That's actually often the cool thing while I'm sitting there and trying to clean the clasts from the sediment. I often, don't know, get kind of emotional, because I think that's exactly the type of mud that was laying at the edge of the lake 125 million years ago.
That was exactly when you started talking about that, like 10 seconds ago. I also for a moment got kind of emotional and was like, wait, that's kind of like just the mud from back then.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're just sitting there, mostly listening, for my part, to a good podcast. I don't know, tetrapod zoology, sometimes skeptoid, stuff like that. And yeah, you just imagine you're sitting at the edge of that lake back in the Lower Cretaceous. Because, I don't know, it's just this surreal feeling of having your hands in this type of mud. I mean, I always tend to say that, well, if you're in the field, it feels like a time travel. I can never be closer to that time period than when I'm actually standing among the rocks deposited back then. You just have this connection to that time. Or at least I feel that connection to that time while standing among the rocks from back then. But this is actually having the proper texture it would have had back then as well. And this gives it this extra vibe. And yeah, I think it sounds pretty weird. Getting emotional about mud.
At least I understand it.
Yeah. But yeah, that's really, I think, everything I would like to talk about in terms of this dig site. I'm really happy I finally talked about it. I always wanted to talk about it. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to the next digging season, and I hope to stay involved with it for a long time in the future.
Yeah, I think the emotional mud is also a beautiful point.
Maybe that's going to be the episode headline: emotional mud.
Yeah, I'm always happy to hear updates. So.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you're gonna be one of the first I'm going to talk about.
Yeah.
With your if something happens, of course, I'm going to tell you.
Nice. Okay. Since time is also actually rather progressed.
Yeah.
Okay. So with that, I thank you for talking about that. I think it was very interesting.
Oh, I can go on.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, bye and have a nice day.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for listening to the RockyTerrain podcast. If you enjoyed listening to us, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Everything addressed in this podcast reflects our own opinion. You can contact us at 4.5gainthemaking@gmail.com. That is 4.5gainthemaking@gmail.com. All music used is from Kevin MacLeod and was downloaded from filmmusic.io under the Creative Commons license. That is heavy interlude for intro and outro, and home bass groove for intermission.
You are a pirate. Yo, how dibbity die. And that's about how far I know the text. It's the hook. Everybody cares about the hook, you know.
Beautiful singer.
Yeah.